Does anybody have any questions? I have been a little remiss. I normally like to start off with questions. I know we're covering a lot of stuff. A lot of the stuff is new. And as Arnie was mentioning beforehand, the terminology can be a little confusing. If I use a term, I tend to, I've been at this for, over 30 years now? So the terminology is literally second nature to me. So if I use terms or concepts or something that you're not clear on, feel free to interrupt me and ask me what I'm talking about. If you think about this stuff when you get home, you have any questions, by all means, write them down. The only question I don't like to hear is, I had a question, but I can't remember what it was. So, does anybody have any questions before we dive right in? All right. Well, last week we finished up talking about the documentary hypothesis, or the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis, which is the theory that Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Bible, that they were written by a large number of people over hundreds of years, and these people can be kind of grouped into what they call threads, and that there's the E thread, the J thread, the P thread, and the D thread, which are the Elohim, the Yahweh, the priestly, and the Deuteronomic code. And that these were all sort of actually combined into books after the exile, and when the Jews returned, then possibly Ezra or somebody else combined them into the books that we have today. And we looked at the reasons for that, and then we finished last week by basically going over each of those reasons and showing that the evidence doesn't really support it. That, for example, that Moses spoke in the third person. Many ancient writers have spoken in the third person. So that still leaves the question of, if the books of Deuteronomy, this documentary hypothesis, their arguments don't hold up, what about our arguments? Do we have any evidence that actually would point to Moses as the author? And the answer is yes. First is the books themselves portray them to be written by Moses. The consistent history throughout the rest of the books in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament refer to Moses as the author. But there's internal clues as well. For example, if these were written late, in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century BC in Israel after the exile, why do they only mention birds and animals that are in Egypt? The author is writing as if the author is from Egypt and is familiar with Egypt. In fact, when it describes the land of Canaan where they're going, it describes this land of milk and honey. How does he describe the land? He describes the land in terms of things that were familiar to people who had lived in Egypt all their life. So the animals, the plants, all things that are mentioned are things that have been very familiar to somebody in Egypt, but nothing that's unique to Palestine, to Canaan, to Israel. Nothing there is mentioned. Now, we can say, well, maybe he just planned it, he's crafty, right? Except this idea of historical accuracy is a very, very new concept. We take it for granted. We go see a movie about Jesus, right? We don't expect people to be dressed in business suits and driving cars as they head off to, down to Bethlehem to register for the census, do we? Why not? It didn't exist. Except, have you ever looked at medieval paintings of Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem? How are they dressed? They're dressed much more like medieval Italians than they are 1st century Jews. Because they didn't have a concept of historical accuracy. They didn't really know that much about the Bible. So they're going to paint Mary and Joseph, they're just going to paint them as they know people. And that's the norm throughout most of history. And so someone writing the 4th century BC if they're writing about events that took place beforehand, they would have written about them in things that were familiar to people living in Jerusalem, living in cities in the 4th century BC. But the books of Moses appear to be written by somebody who was very familiar with Egypt, didn't know a whole lot about Israel, and if you look at a lot of the laws and a lot of the things they're supposed to do, it's written for a nomadic people, not written for city dwellers. So a lot of the internal clues point to the fact that this was written much earlier and written from the perspective of a nomadic people who knew a lot about Egypt and know a whole lot about Israel. One other factor we can look at is the book of Deuteronomy. Now, the book of Deuteronomy is actually a legal contract. Both sides agree that it was the last written. Now, if we look at a legal contract, it's basically a suzerainty treaty, which is essentially a treaty between a greater power and a lesser power. It might be a treaty, for example, between a king and a knight to, certain contracts. Well, this is a contract between God and his people. So, like everything else, contracts change over time. And if you look at the form and structure of Deuteronomy, it's actually the form and structure of a legal contract. And scholars have taken that and they've looked at the various legal contracts of that type over the centuries. And guess what? It's very nicely in the couple hundred years before Israel. It doesn't fit at all with the contracts that were written at the time the liberal scholars say it was written. There's a lot more evidence that we can look at. If you're all interested, you can check out Gleason Archer's survey of New Testament, Old Testament introduction. Has a very long part on that. But the bottom line is the evidence put forth by the liberals doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. There's considerable evidence to support the Mosaic authorship. So then why do the liberals hold the theories that they do? If what I'm saying is correct, the evidence is so clear, why do they hold what they hold? Part of the problem is that there's evidence that supports it and there's evidence that against it, but it's not a slam dunk. We have not found the ancient manuscripts, like we will see when we get to the New Testament, it's much clearer, but we haven't found ancient manuscripts going back that far. We found fragments, the fragments going back 600 and 700 years BC, but not manuscripts. So I think the evidence is pretty clear in favor of the Mosaic authorship, but in favor of the Mosaic authorship, in all honesty, isn't proof of the Mosaic authorship. And the other factor is that within liberal scholarship, the documentary hypothesis took hold in the early 1800s, began to at least, and was fully developed by the end of the 19th century. And throughout most of the 20th century, it's the foundation for liberal scholarship of the Old Testament. And as the foundation, people have literally built their careers off of these assumptions as they expand and develop theories based on expanding and developing the documentary hypothesis. And so it's thoroughly ingrained within liberal scholarship, and therefore it's going to be very difficult to dislodge. To give you an example that's completely outside of biblical scholarship. Right, at the turn of the last century, so at about the same time, there was a man named Wegener from Germany, and he was a meteorologist, well respected, In those days, scientists weren't as well segregated as they were today. So if you were a meteorologist, you were also a lot of other things. And one day he began looking at the coast of South America and the coast of Africa and thought, those things kind of look like they go together. And he didn't just go by that. He actually started doing a lot of research and many years studied this. He found that not only did the coast on both sides seem to kind of match up, but the mountain ranges matched up. So if you had a mountain range over here, kind of had a mountain range that continued over here. And a whole lot of geological features and plants and animals and all sorts of things. He amassed a huge amount of evidence that showed this. And finally he published his work about the turn of the 20th century and was literally laughed at and ridiculed by the Geological Society. And in fact, at one point, one of the geologists said, if he's correct, all of geology has to be tossed out the window, and we have to start all over again. And as a result, his theories were derided. His theories were rejected, and he could not get a university position in his own country. He ended up having to go, he was from Germany, he ended up having to go to Austria, and even there, the only thing he could get was a position in meteorology. He couldn't get a position in geology. And 30 years later, he died, and basically rejected. Fast forward to the 1960s, and geologists looking at core samples coming up from the ocean floor noticed that you have the rifts in the center of the ocean, and then over here the core samples would be, and for simplicity's sake, they're oriented one way, and over here they were oriented the same way, but then they would switch. And they would also switch over here. And you get these patterns going out that whenever they found one over here, they found a matching one over here. And what they realized is that the Earth's crust was coming up and splitting out. And what they were seeing here was actually oscillations in the Earth's magnetic field, and whenever it switched, this switched. And of course, since it switched here, as it moved out in matching pairs. And they kind of realized, wow, we have what Wegener had called continental drift, is now called plate tectonics, and is now the foundation for modern geology. Wegener never knew that. He died with his theory being thoroughly rejected because it did not fit within the norms of geology of the day.
I just have to say, now I can finally forgive my second grade teacher, because I can remember, seriously, I remember looking at the map and going, were they ever connected? Because in my mind I could see them connected. Oh, no. But this is 1964 before I knew about it.
That's about exactly the time they found out, yeah.
How cool is that? Yeah. I hate to tell you how I thought of that through my life, and now today it's like,
see,
okay.
and if you'd published, your career would have been ruined. So yeah, now today this is taught, and it's taught very much with the same evidence. I mean, they've added this piece to it, but it's taught very much with the same evidence that Wegener used. So it wasn't a matter of evidence. It was a matter of his theories didn't fit in with what they believed, and therefore they were rejected, and he was rejected. And that's exactly the same situation, I believe, that conservative scholars are in when we stand up and we say, Moses wrote the books that Moses wrote. Yeah, we can demolish their arguments, and we can show the evidence in favor of us, but it ultimately doesn't really matter because it doesn't fit their view of what this subject is, their view of the history of the origin of religions. There's one other factor as well, which is they fundamentally don't believe in the supernatural. I mean, they may believe in God, but they don't really believe that God intervenes in the world. And therefore, when they see miracles, they assume it's false. Now, think about this for a second. Just run through this. I think I've done this before, but it's good to keep this in mind. If you reject miracles, then when you read the accounts in the Bible about miracles, then you have to reject them. They have to be false. And if they're false, then it means those who wrote them either did not really know what they were writing about, or they were lying. Either way, they're not reliable. And therefore the Bible's not reliable. Notice we reach that conclusion simply on two beliefs. One, that there's no supernatural, and two, the Bible talks about miracles. So when you read a liberal scholar, it may be embellished with a whole bunch of other stuff, but when you dig down through all the reasoning, it fundamentally comes down to they don't believe in the supernatural, at least not in terms of an impact in human events, and the Bible talks about the supernatural impacting biblical events or human events. And therefore, they don't believe it. So you get this not only in the book of the first 5 books of the Bible, but go to Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1. Isaiah chapter 45, verse 1. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I will take hold of, to subdue nations before him, and to strip kings of their armor, and to open the doors before him, so that the gates will not be shut. You're a liberal scholar, you're reading about this. What's the problem? Cyrus lived a couple hundred years after Isaiah. So how could Isaiah write this? That's not a problem for us, is it? No. We believe Isaiah was a prophet, not a historian. And therefore, when we see prophecy in the writings of a prophet, that to us is a confirmation that they're a prophet. But if you're a liberal scholar and you see prophecy in the writing of a prophet, then that's a problem, because you don't believe in prophecy. At least not specific prophecy that actually predict future events. So because of this and a number of other accurate prophecies, if you're reading about the book of Isaiah in the work of a liberal scholar, you're going to read that there are 2 Isaiahs, possibly even 3. Because they're pretty convinced that Isaiah wrote Isaiah, but then Isaiah talks about things that are in the future. And therefore they come up, okay, well, we'll create a second Isaiah. And he wrote about things after they occurred and called himself Isaiah. But then that doesn't quite fit for some scholars, so they end up making up a 3rd Isaiah. And then, of course, what's probably the most prophetic book in the Old Testament? Daniel. Yeah. Liberal scholars I have great in my book, Evidence for the Bible, when you get to, if you ever read that and you get to that point, I have a lot of fun there. Because when you do Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, which predicts when the Messiah will come, they believe that the prophecy, I mean, they admit the prophecies in Daniel are just too darn accurate. But they're in a quandary because they can say, okay, they're too darn accurate, had to be written by a later person, right? So if we start off with Daniel, and the history of Daniel begins here, but then it's predicting things all along here, right? And we don't longer need this. Yeah, that's the thing about my classes. You probably never really thought you'd come today to learn about plate tectonics, did you? So Daniel's writing about all these things down through history, right? And here's when the Messiah comes, and right? So that's easy. We'll just date Daniel later than all the events that Daniel writes about. Except there's a problem. They have manuscripts of Daniel from roughly about 150 BC. So from approximately 150 BC, they have manuscripts of Daniel found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they have to date Daniel, unless you believe, and if you believe these are the originals, the best you can do is here, but more likely they have to fudge, and in reality they have to put Daniel back this way. So they can't put him back too far because there's too many of these darn prophecies. So, yeah, the big problem with Daniel chapter 9 is it predicts when the Messiah will come. Very clearly, in fact, down to the year. And that's could not have been written afterwards. And even then you'd have problems because not likely a book in the Jewish canon would have predicted the coming of the Messiah, of Jesus Christ. So even then you just have all kinds of problems. So they're really in a quandary here as to how to deal with this. And I have some quotes where basically I got one little scholar who basically metaphorically tosses his hands up and says, we can't make any sense out of these numbers. Except we can make sense out of them. The problem is if you make sense out of them, they point to the Messiah in 30 BC or 33 BC, depending on how you do the numbers, right? But it's either going to be 30 AD or 33 AD, right? There's a little bit of wiggle room there as to how you do the numbers and when you pick your starting point, things like that. So you can, somewhere in that period, Daniel says the Messiah will come, that he will be killed, and shortly after that, the temple will be destroyed. But we know the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. That's just what Daniel says. Except Daniel has manuscripts from here. And so you don't see a lot of liberal scholars going near Daniel. In fact, I've heard them write it off as complete fiction should not be in the Bible. Because it's too difficult for them to deal with. Then there's a whole bunch of other little annoying details about Daniel. Is they used to be able to reject Daniel because the history was so bad. Because it just flat out got the history of Babylon incorrect. And they could say, see, that's proof that it was written much later because we now know the ending history, we know what happened, and therefore Daniel got it wrong. Except as they have done more and more research, they found out, no, Daniel actually got it right. It was the later historians that got it wrong. which provides even a bigger problem because our first condemnations of Daniel were based on historians that would have been known to people in this period. So if these people were writing it following the histories that were generally known, they would have made the mistakes that later scholars did. Except Daniel got it right. He also did annoying little things like use terms that were very common in Babylon at the time of its fall, but were unknown later on, and thus when the people were doing the translation of the Septuagint at about the same time, which is a translation from Hebrew into Greek, they didn't know how to translate these terms, and so they translated them incorrectly. But if they didn't know how to translate it, how did the writer know how to write it? So Daniel's using some technical terms within the court of Babylon, and he's using them correctly because he knew about them. He wrote about them here. The Septuagint was done at about the same time that the liberal scholars say that Daniel wrote. Except the people who did the Septuagint didn't know those terms and didn't know how to translate them, but somehow the writer of Daniel did. So Daniel is a huge problem for him. Frankly, it just doesn't make sense. Unless you say, wait a minute, maybe the writer of Daniel did have supernatural influence. And suddenly this no longer becomes a problem. This becomes a confirmation. The accurate prophecies that don't happen to stop when the manuscripts appear, but continue on after the manuscripts appear, those prophecies are signs that Daniel was inspired by God. And could predict not only the things before the manuscripts appeared, but could predict the things that would happen after the manuscripts appeared. When we look at the Old Testament, when we look at biblical scholarship, the biggest difference between a liberal scholar and a conservative scholar is over this issue of, is the supernatural influence within the events of humankind possible? If you say yes, it's possible, you don't have to start assuming that Daniel is a prophet. You can come to the book of Daniel completely, you can even come a little bit skeptical. Right? And say, okay, prove it to me. I'm not going to believe it until you show me evidence. You don't have to start off assuming Daniel's a prophet. You can do that. And when you start looking at, well, when was it written? Well, he described events accurately. He used the terminology correctly. All indications are that whoever wrote Daniel lived at about the same time as Daniel. And you can look at, well, what did he write? He wrote about prophecy and about things that would happen in the future. And those prophecies are very, very accurate. Down to the point that, depending on how you calculate the math, within a couple of years, he predicts the ministry of Jesus Christ. And he predicts that shortly after that, he predicts the Messiah would come, that the Messiah would be killed, and shortly after that, the temple would be destroyed. Which is exactly what we see. The biggest difference between the liberal scholar and the conservative scholar is the conservative scholar is free to conclude that Daniel was a prophet inspired by God, where the liberal scholar cannot reach that conclusion. That's the Old Testament. Any questions before we move on? Obviously, we have not really touched a lot on the Old Testament, but hopefully that gives you some idea of its structure and how we got it, and a little bit of the reliability behind it.
I took a quick peek at chapter 9, and is it where he says 770s? Is
Yes.
that where the 490 comes from?
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
right. Okay.
Yeah, if you go in my book, you'll see that's all broken down as exactly how you get that. Everyone pretty much agrees that these are groups. There's a word there is group, and they're all groups of 7, and the groups of 7 are 7 years. Everyone's pretty much in agreement that he's talking about years there. Even the liberal scholars agree that he's talking about years. Any other questions? Let's do the next handout. Let's see. That's there you go. Yeah. The New Testament. So, this is from the IFV, International Standard Version. And again, like in the Old Testament, the structure and order of the books is not inspired. They're just sort of grouped, and they're not grouped chronologically. They're grouped by, we'll see the first, or the first group you see is the Gospels. Then you have the history, which is Acts, single book. Then you have, now they break it down into the first group of letters, which is the explanation, and then the application, and then the consummation, the book of Revelations. Now, you see through this handout, one of the things they tried to do was to make everything about Jesus, which is kind of a reasonable thing to do. Right? So Matthew is the Messiah for the Jewish people, Mark the Messiah for the Romans, Luke the Messiah for the Gentiles, John the Messiah for believers. Then you have the preaching of the Messiah in Acts, the gospel of the Messiah, Romans, 1 Corinthians, holy living in the Messiah, and so on and so on and so on. Which is a perfectly legitimate way to do it. Although, we just finished studying 1 John. So what does he say about 1 John?
Our assurance in the Messiah.
Our assurance in the Messiah. Having just finished 1 John, is that what have jumped to you what 1 John is about? Yeah, it's in there. But 1 John's about so much more than that, isn't it? 3 John, the hospitality of the Messiah. 2 John, the doctrine of the Messiah. So by trying to force this into being able to say it's something about the Messiah for every single book, so you notice it's not inaccurate, but it does lead to some distortion. So that's something to remember whenever you take and you read through somebody, they're talking about a book, and they say, and it's the book of whatever, right? Like Philippians, for a long time in my life, Philippians was labeled the book of joy, right? Because the word joy appears so much in the book of Philippians. Except Philippians really is not about joy. Philippians is about unity. It's about humility. It's about submission. Let me hand out the next handout. Now, this is how we find the books in our current Bible. This next handout, F, is about the chronology. What order were the books written in? Now, notice that the first book listed is Matthew, and it's got a double asterisk. And notice the note at the top of the page. Some books appear in the list more than once because of uncertainty about their dates. So, some believe Matthew is the first book to be written. Welcome. Some believe Matthew is the first book to be written, and that's why it appears on the list here. But if you notice, if you slide on down about 2/3 of the way, you'll see that Matthew appears again as being written in the 60s. Some people believe it was written then. And this is, some conservative scholars believe it was written then. So realize that this represents a difference of opinion. And in fact, you notice down at the bottom, what we'll be getting to next week is the whole discussion of what's called the synoptic problem, which is how do you reconcile the books of the Bible in terms of the order that they were written. Now, the synoptic problem has nothing to do at all with inspiration. There are conservative scholars who firmly believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are inspired by God, and believe Matthew was written first, Luke, then Mark, and finally John. And then there are scholars that are just as much convinced of the inspiration and authority of Scripture who believe Mark was written first, Matthew, and Luke. And I would suspect that some of our pastors may disagree on this topic. In fact, I would almost bet that some of the pastors disagree with my view.
Why does it matter?
We'll talk about that next week when we get a little bit more into it. At some level, it really doesn't. On the other hand, when you're beginning to understand certain concepts, at some level of Bible study, it does make a difference. You're trying to really understand, for example, if you're reading through a passage and you're trying to understand what was what was a person trying to argue. When Matthew was writing, what Matthew was trying to put forth an argument, which means all the gospel writers were selecting pieces of information and they were leaving pieces of information out simply by the constraints of having to write something. And why did they include certain things and why did they leave out certain things? And that's sometimes give you a better idea of what they're actually trying to argue overall. Why is John so different from all the other Gospels? Right? So at a certain level, it doesn't matter at all. But at certain levels of when you get deeper and deeper into trying to understand what a particular author was trying to say, it does begin to have an impact. And more importantly, it's just, for this class, it's out there and it's something we talk about. You can go through your entire Christian life and never care. You can go through your entire Christian life and be wrong on this topic, and it's not going to matter completely. On the other hand, it's a question that's raised, people ask it, and therefore, in this class, since we're talking about how we got the Bible and why we can trust it, we will deal with it. So, what I recommend is a little homework assignment for next week. If you go to Matthew 3:13, Matthew 3:13, the baptism of Jesus. So read that, 3:13 through 17. Then read the corresponding passage in Mark, which is 1:9 through 11. the corresponding passage in Luke, which is 3:21 and 22, and the corresponding passage in John, which is 3:31 through 34.
They were all at that baptism, I think.
No, they were not.
They weren't.
No.
Which ones were and which ones weren't?
None of them were. Oh, well, no, I take that back. John was. Because John was a disciple of John, the Apostle John was a disciple of John the Baptist. And so he was there. Yeah. Matthew was a tax collector who didn't enter the scene until much, much later. And Mark, I'm not sure when Mark enters the scene, but I'm pretty sure he probably wasn't at the baptism. And Luke certainly wasn't at the
So
baptism.
if they wrote about it, the Holy Spirit must have told them about it.
Yep.
Because they weren't there.
Or they were using other sources. Now, one of the things very clear with
God
Matthew,
inspired,
Mark,
it
and
would be the Holy Spirit, wouldn't it?
well, they definitely guided by the Holy Spirit. But it's pretty clear that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are interrelated in some fashion. Because when you read through them carefully, you'll notice that they parallel each other, even down to the actual words being used in some places. But we'll be getting into that next week. But first, for this one, just read over these four passages. And just look at the similarities, look for the differences. And see if you can think which one you think of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those three are very clearly interlinked. Somebody used somebody. Right? So see if you can figure who was first, who was second, and who was third. Who used whom? Who used whom? And then you'll notice John is close, but even John is different. And then we'll talk a little bit more about it. I'll give you, actually next week when we come in, one of the handouts you get next week is a detailed breakdown of this passage, which will show you all the interlinkings and all the similarities, and it's based on a translation I did directly from the Greek, so I actually translate. I don't go for a readable translation per se. I go for a translation that shows which parts are exactly the same, that highlights the similarities and highlights the differences.